It was just before dawn, about 40 nautical miles south of Kodiak Island, when the net came up heavier than it should have. The crew of a commercial trawler, working a routine pollock haul, immediately knew something was wrong. The winches strained, the hydraulics whined, and when the catch finally broke the surface in the gray Alaskan half-light, the men on deck stopped talking. Within 6 hours, a Coast Guard vessel was alongside them. Within 12, the crew was under what they described as a courtesy request to remain quiet. Within 3 days, every public reference to the incident, which had briefly appeared on a fishing forum and a local radio show, had gone silent. The boat returned to port. The catch, or whatever the catch had been, did not come with it. This is the story of what a fishing crew says they pulled up off Alaska, why the Coast Guard appears to have intervened, and why, months later, nobody involved will say a word on the record. Start with the geography. The Gulf of Alaska is one of the strangest pieces of ocean on Earth. It is deep, cold, and biologically explosive. Nutrient upwellings from the continental shelf feed some of the richest fisheries in the Northern Hemisphere. But the Gulf is also a place where the modern world keeps running into things it does not expect. Unidentified sonar contacts, underwater sounds like the famous bloop recorded in 1997 that defied easy explanation for years, military exercises that are announced only after the fact. Research. Submarines whose missions remain classified long past their crew's retirement. The Gulf is busy with official activity, and not all of that activity is public. Commercial fishing, against this backdrop, is a kind of accidental reconnaissance. A trawler drags a net for miles. It does not discriminate. Whatever lives in that column of water, whatever has died and sunk to the sea floor, whatever has been lost, whatever has been deliberately dumped, the net picks it up. Crews have told stories for decades about strange things coming over the transom. Most of those stories stay in the wheelhouse. A few leak. The incident in question, reported by at least 2 separate sources with connections to the Kodiak fleet, allegedly occurred during a winter season opener. The boat, a vessel of roughly 120 feet in length, had been working a known pollock ground when the aft net began reporting weights far outside normal range. At first, the skipper assumed it was a snag. Old cable, a lost crab pot, perhaps a sunken container from a container ship. The crew began the slow retrieval. According to accounts that have been described in fragments across private conversations, the object that emerged was not obviously an animal. It was not obviously a machine. Descriptions, when they exist at all, are contradictory. One version says it resembled a large biological mass, segmented, pale, with features that did not match any known marine species. Another version says it was mostly metallic, partially overgrown, as if it had been in the water for a long time. A third version mixes the two, suggesting an object that had biological and manufactured elements entangled beyond easy separation. All 3 versions share one detail. Nobody on the crew had ever seen anything like it before. And within a surprisingly short time, somebody official was very interested in it. Here we have to pause, because the trap in a story like this is obvious. A fishing crew's account, filtered through rumor, shared secondhand, is the weakest possible form of evidence. Memory under stress is unreliable. Maritime tall tales are older than maritime itself. The fact that nobody had ever seen anything like it is a phrase that has been attached to unusual but entirely explainable catches for as long as people have been pulling things out of the sea. Sunfish in northern waters, deep-sea squid surfaced by temperature anomalies, decomposing whale carcasses that no longer look like whales. The world under the ocean is populated with strange shapes, and strange does not always mean unprecedented. So, what makes this case different, if anything? It is the official response. That is what keeps the story alive. The United States Coast Guard does not usually dispatch a cutter to a commercial trawler over a weird catch. The Coast Guard handles search and rescue, fisheries enforcement, pollution response, and maritime security. If the object in the net had been an ordinary hazard, the proper channel would have been the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which manages fisheries science, or the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. If it had been a dead animal of unusual interest, the National Marine Fisheries Service would have wanted photographs, samples, and paperwork. If it had been human remains, there would have been a formal investigation and a local coroner's involvement. In none of those standard pathways does a Coast Guard vessel show up before sunrise and escort a fishing boat to a specific position. The Coast Guard, asked for comment by at least one regional journalist, reportedly acknowledged a response to an unspecified maritime event on the approximate date in question. The official statement did not mention the trawler by name. It did not describe the nature of the event. It did describe the response as consistent with interagency protocols, which is a phrase that in practice means more than one agency was involved. More than one agency. That, quietly, is where the story sharpens. When multiple federal agencies respond to something at sea, the possibilities narrow. The combinations that actually happen are limited. Coast Guard plus NOAA suggests a biological or environmental event of significant scale. Coast Guard plus the Navy suggests a military asset, an unexploded ordnance concern, or a vessel of interest. Coast Guard plus a civilian research agency suggests a joint scientific operation. Coast Guard plus an unnamed federal presence, which is what some sources have quietly implied, opens a door nobody wants to walk through on the record. Former Coast Guard officers interviewed over the years on unrelated matters have acknowledged that certain parts of Alaskan waters are treated internally as sensitive corridors, submarine transit lanes, test ranges, areas where undersea cables run, areas where, in the past, naval accidents have left debris that remains classified. When something unusual surfaces in one of those zones, the response is not improvised. It follows a procedure that has existed for decades. That procedure, according to declassified summaries from the late Cold War era, includes securing the object, debriefing the witnesses, and limiting public dissemination pending a technical review. It does not include, necessarily, any acknowledgement that the procedure has been invoked. Witnesses are not gagged in any legal sense. They are simply asked, courteously, to keep the details private while the review is ongoing. Reviews can take a long time. Dr. Bruce Robison, a senior scientist at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute who has spent decades studying the deep ocean, has argued in multiple interviews that most unidentified marine catches turn out, on examination, to be known species in unusual conditions. He cites cases of giant squid, oarfish, and frilled sharks being reported as unknown creatures by experienced fishing crews simply because those species are rarely encountered near the surface. He urges, sensibly, that the first hypothesis for any strange catch should be a real animal in an unfamiliar state, not a novel discovery. His caution is the right caution. It may even be the correct answer here. A large, decomposing, deep-water animal that had never been pulled to the surface before could plausibly explain some of the descriptions, and the unusual response may have involved environmental health concerns, invasive species protocols, or sample collection for a university research program that, for reasons of paperwork, was never announced publicly. But Robison's caution does not explain the Coast Guard escort. It does not explain the reported interagency presence. It does not explain the silence of the crew, who, if the object had been a merely unusual animal, would by now be sharing photographs with a shrug and a fish story grin. Fishermen are, famously, not shy about strange catches. Silence in that community is itself unusual. What could it have been, realistically? Several possibilities. It may have been a piece of military hardware, perhaps a lost sensor buoy, or a retired underwater vehicle that had been in the water longer than anticipated, and whose recovery fell under classified protocols. Cold War-era instruments, deployed in the Gulf for anti-submarine monitoring, are still occasionally recovered in fishing nets, and their recovery remains sensitive because some of them use technologies that have been reused in modern platforms. Historical records indicate that the Navy has lost at least a dozen such devices in northern waters since the 1960s. It may have been a biological specimen of genuine scientific interest. A novel, gelatinous organism, perhaps, or known, species showing abnormal features that would require careful handling. Marine biologists do request federal escorts in rare cases when a specimen has legal protections or biosecurity implications. It may have been human-related in a way that required discretion. Remains from a lost vessel. Material from a maritime incident. These cases are handled with appropriate privacy for families involved. It may have been, more mundanely, the contents of a shipping container or industrial waste from a source that someone would prefer not to be publicly identified. And it may have been something else entirely, something for which no ready category exists. That is the possibility that keeps the story humming. Look at the pattern. Unusual catches in the Gulf of Alaska, followed by quiet agency response, followed by information gaps, have occurred more than once over the past 20 years. In 2013, a fishing crew reported pulling up what they described as an unfamiliar carcass, roughly 50 miles from Kodiak. The story briefly hit local news. Then it went dead. No follow-up, no official statement. In 2018, another crew, working the Bering Sea, reportedly encountered something on sonar that they could not match to any known feature. Their logs were, according to crew members, later requested by an outside party. They did not receive them back. Any one of these events on its own might be nothing. A pattern of them, combined with a consistent style of official response, starts to look less like coincidence and more like protocol. The Coast Guard, for its part, is one of the most respected institutions in American public life. Its silence on any given incident is not necessarily evidence of a cover-up. It may simply be evidence that the incident is, by regulation, not its story to tell. Some of what happens in American waters falls under the jurisdiction of agencies that do not routinely hold press conferences. That is not the same as malice. It is the slow, quiet machinery of a country that keeps some of its work private. Still, in a democratic society, quiet machinery is accountable, eventually. The question is how long eventually takes. Sometimes decades, sometimes longer. And sometimes a file is simply released, decades after the fact, and a few historians nod and add it to the record, and nobody else ever finds out. What we can say with honesty is this. A fishing crew off Alaska allegedly pulled up an object they could not identify. An official response appears to have involved more than one agency. No public statement has clarified what was recovered or where it went. The crew has chosen, or been asked, to remain quiet. The story has become, in the way of modern maritime lore, half memory and half rumor. The deep ocean keeps its own secrets. It always has. Out beyond the continental shelf, in cold water thousands of feet down, there are things that have never been photographed, animals that have never been named, objects that have never been listed in any public ledger. Sometimes the surface world reaches down and pulls one of them up. Sometimes that encounter is celebrated, written up, turned into a paper. And sometimes it is quietly escorted to a port, transferred to someone with the right credentials, and never publicly spoken of again. Your theory is as valid as anyone else's here, because the data simply does not allow a confident conclusion. That is the honest state of the story. If you have ever fished those waters, or know someone who has, you may already have heard versions of this tale, told quietly around a galley table on a boat rolling at anchor. The sea keeps shaping those stories. It will probably never stop. There is also a social dimension to this story that outsiders often miss. The commercial fishing community in Alaska is tight, interconnected, and deeply practical. Skippers know each other. Crews rotate between boats. rumors move fast, through galley conversations at port, faster than through any official channel. In that environment, when a specific boat's name stops coming up in connection with a specific incident, it is noticeable. It means something. Either the incident was unremarkable and has simply dropped out of conversation, which happens all the time, or the people closest to it have made a deliberate choice to stop talking about it. Those two possibilities look different from the outside only in their details. Experienced skippers, asked about the broader pattern, often shrug and say they have seen strange things at sea and would rather not be the ones talking about them on camera. That is not evasion, it is the culture. Alaskan fishing is a profession, with its own ethics, and one of those ethics is that what happens out there is, to some extent, nobody's business but the people on the boat. That makes verification harder. It also makes the occasional leak, when it comes, more credible, because it usually comes from somebody who has good reasons to break a norm. Another factor is the nature of the Gulf's underwater terrain. The seafloor drops off dramatically from the continental shelf into deep trenches. The Aleutian Trench, not far from where the alleged incident took place, reaches depths of over 25,000 feet. Objects that fall into those depths rarely come back. The fact that something, whatever it was, came up in a net at all suggests it was either relatively close to the surface, possibly caught, in a current that brought it into the trawler's working depth, or had been rising for reasons of its own. Both possibilities are worth sitting with. Consider the environmental side. Climate-driven changes in the Gulf over the past 2 decades have altered species distributions in ways that were not predicted by older fisheries models. Warm water anomalies have pushed some species north, pulled others up from deeper water, and produced catch compositions that local fishermen describe as unlike anything they saw earlier in their careers. If a previously deep-dwelling organism, not well documented because it rarely left its preferred zone, happened to be displaced into commercial fishing grounds, the resulting catch could look, to everyone involved, like something entirely new. That might not even be wrong. A species rarely seen is, in practical terms, a new species to the people seeing it for the first time. That explanation is boring in one sense and important in another. It would mean the mystery is not about hidden agencies or secret technologies. It would mean the mystery is about a changing ocean, and about what lives down there in the parts of the water column we never look at. That is a story in its own right. It is also a story that, for reasons of jurisdiction and scientific process, might involve federal agency response that looks to an outside observer a lot like the kind of response described in the accounts we have. In other words, the Coast Guard showing up does not, by itself, prove that something extraordinary was found. It may mean only that somebody at a desk in Juneau or Anchorage, hearing about a highly unusual catch in a sensitive area, decided to send a vessel to observe, document, and, if appropriate, transfer the specimen to scientists who were better equipped to handle it. That is a normal procedure. It does not usually make the news. When it does, the attention often distorts the event beyond recognition. Still, the silence does keep coming up. And silence, in the age of smartphones and GPS-stamped photographs, is increasingly hard to maintain. If this were a simple story of a weird fish, you would expect at some point for somebody's cousin to post a photo. You would expect a deckhand, years later, to mention it in a podcast interview. You would expect a regional newspaper, on a slow week, to run a small feature. None of those things appear to have happened in any clean, verifiable form, which is itself a little unusual. It is also worth remembering that Alaska has a long history of being the last place stories come out of. The state's geography, the spread of its small communities, the distance from major media centers, and the rhythms of its industries all conspire to let things happen quietly. A local incident that would generate 20 news cycles in a lower 48 city can play out in Alaska across a few bar conversations. A chapter in a memoir nobody reads, and a slightly updated entry on a regional fishing forum. That is not evidence of a cover-up. It is just what happens in a place where the population is small, the distances are enormous, and the people who live there tend to handle their own business. Given that context, the mystery off Kodiak may never have a clean resolution. It may belong to the same quiet shelf as a dozen other Alaskan stories, each one briefly visible, each one fading into the long northern silence. That does not make it less interesting. In some ways, it makes it more so because it forces us to think about how knowledge actually travels in a world that is still, in pockets, genuinely unlit by the full glare of modern information. The Gulf of Alaska is one of those pockets. What happens there stays there unless the people involved decide otherwise. For anyone tempted to go chase the story on their own, a word of practical advice. The waters off Kodiak are real, and they are unforgiving. The romance of a maritime mystery fades quickly when the wind picks up and the deck ices over. The fishermen who work those waters know what they are doing, and they know what they have seen. If they do not want to talk, there are reasons, and those reasons deserve respect. Mystery, in the end, is not just a storytelling hook. It is sometimes the correct response to a world that does not owe us all of its answers on our preferred schedule. If this one ever cracks open, if the crew speaks, if a document surfaces, it will change how we talk about the Gulf of Alaska. Until then, we are left with the shape of a silence, and the knowledge that silence, at sea, usually means somebody knows exactly what happened, and has decided it is not our turn to know yet.